following is intended to provoke thought and challenge our assumptions. The opinions we hold are subject to change based on new and valid information. Your discretion is advised.
Did you like rock right away? Or did you have to find the right band
the
first?
definition of rock changed. The first rock, if we knew it, were the Beatles. And they weren't really rock, they were pop. But, you know, that's how we viewed them as, because they were doing electric guitars and they were being a little bit, you know, transgressive. And then, of course, it was the Rolling Stones, who were really doing more rock and doing the bad boys to the good boys of the Beatles.
Yeah, because they were like posh.
They were that.
Yeah, the ladies loved them. Right.
They did indeed, apparently. Although I think the Rolling Stones had a few lady friends as well.
Sure. But like when you think of the Rolling Stones, like when you think of the Beatles, there's like that image of the crowd, right? And the women like fainting and
the fainting. They got to the point where they didn't even play guitars in their concerts because nobody could hear a thing. It was all the screaming. You know, they didn't have the good setups with kind of wall of speakers and things like that.
That must have been an incredible time too.
I remember it, only we never got to see them, but I remember when the disc jockeys got out and we called up and we got a little pamphlet called Meet the Beatles. And that was like, wow, we're in there now. We know, not just Paul and John, but Ringo and George and stuff like that.
Yeah, I wonder if it was on some level more special back then, because now it's like so accessible. Whereas before, you couldn't like go on YouTube and see a concert of your favorite band. You have to wait on MTV for them to play the song that you like, and
we didn't have MTV, but that's okay.
Even further back,
we had AM radio. FM came later, and that became more the alternative stuff. It was better quality. AM was the popular stuff.
Did your parents?
Do you know what AM and FM stand for?
I don't even know what it stands for.
Amplitude modulation. In other words, you have to have a signal that has information in it. And you do it by modifying the amplitude. And the other one is the frequency modulation. You have the frequency, and that difference in frequency is the signal. And that the radios play.
I think it's crazy someone came up with that. That's just wild. That's not a...
Once it starts, it goes on, It started microphones. That was the big thing.
Yeah. I don't even know how microphones work. Like, I
they
conceptually
create a magnetic, the magnets move, and that creates an electric signal. It is all electric signals.
And the fact that someone figured that out just blows my mind.
Yeah, Bell, Edison, people like that, whatever, yeah.
I guess a different type of intelligence.
Yes, and we've talked about all the other people who are becoming rich now with a different intelligence that you haven't quite caught up with. Whatever.
I tell people that something that my dad would say is, there's people who are a lot dumber than you who get really rich. I'm like, you could say you're a lot smarter than people who get rich.
Well, I say it to myself as well. Dumber people than me can figure this out.
Right.
I can do it.
What is it, right? I know this guy is my friend's uncle, and he struck it big after all these like failed ideas. One of them was to create mice. Like when you use a computer mouse, he would turn it into a mouse. So it'd have like little felt ears and a felt
I've seen those
body.
Advertised, yes.
You're like, this was one of the ideas. Is like, this is gonna make it. And then he went through a series of bad ideas like that, and he made a lot of money.
I didn't take the course, but the Michigan Business School, the one on entrepreneurship was called Failure 101.
I mean, that's what it is. Fail forward. I mean, the more opportunities you get to fail, the higher likelihood you're going to succeed.
As long as you don't blow everything and you can't get any more financing, but yes, that's right.
Or die.
Or die, or, whatever, right. So that's just the thing. And so the same with your podcasts. You might fail on some of them, but you're learning how to do it, and some of them will become stellar.
I hope so. I don't know if any of them become stellar yet. Right now,
You told me the guy came up with mice, and there was probably a series of things like that.
That's true. I think, this has just been an exercise in talking to people and getting at something deeper than, like, you know, a lot of times when you're having conversations naturally, you get into some deep stuff, but it ebbs and flows where this is like intentional talking about something for a prolonged period of time. And
Yep.
you know, it can be difficult, especially you're at a party or something, you get into a flow and then something interrupts it, or
Typically, that's what happens in almost all conversations. Someone else wants to talk about something else.
right. But this is an intentional focus on, you know, so it's been a practice in doing that and just practicing listening.
It is interesting to have intentional conversations on topics. You do that when you teach, you do it at conferences, but you don't do it in a way like this where just a couple people are talking and trying to really get at that. I've seen versions of that. This guy, Bill Moyers, who would have been one of LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson advisors, had a show, and it was all about the Bible. And the conversation went over a series of, I don't know if it was 8 episodes or whatever number. I've watched at least some of them. And they had a Catholic priest, they had a Jewish rabbi, you have a Muslim, and you had like a Protestant. So they together were talking about different passages of the Old Testament. And it was an intentional conversation that went on and on. I mean, you had session, and you came back and you went to another part of the book, I assume. And I don't know what the progression was.
Right.
But, and they said, after a while, you know, if you had, you know, these, you know, like 4 different people talking, and they said, then it was a 5th voice that came out, and that was the Bible itself. And so you talk, and you all start to see there's something deeper that's behind what all the stuff that each of you are bringing to the conversation.
Right. It's hard for a lot of people to understand that, right? They're so rooted in their own picture, not recognizing it's the same analogy of, you know, the 5 religious men who are touching the elephant, and they're all trying to figure out what they're seeing, and they're like, oh, the elephant's like a snake, and then somebody's on the trunk, and then, oh no, it's like a tail, or so it's like a wiggly thing, you know, they're at the tail, or there's this big tree, and they're at the feet, you know, it's
right. We're all getting a piece of it, and there is a bigger reality to it, and that you know, story, that fable, or whatever you want to call it, how long has that been around? A long time. And so people understood that concept, and yet we're still grappling with it. We talk about pieces of it, but it is hard to put it together into the whole. And if anything, we've probably become more fragmented in our understandings, and making it more difficult to really get a more holistic view of these things.
Well, it's like the English language has developed multiple different types of language. Like, I speak science, right? Like, somebody believes that they believe in science, and so when they orient themselves to the world, they approach it scientifically, and then somebody else approaches it politically, and somebody else approaches it religiously. So then you have the people speaking the same language, but really not. So they're all speaking English, but you know, I could give you an example. Like when COVID happened, there was people who didn't understand science, who believed we're doing the right thing because science tells us, and then they're fighting with other people who also don't understand science. So you're like, put your mask on. You're like, no, science says. And you're like, no, it doesn't. Science says this. And so you have 2 people arguing about whether or not the science tells them to do one or the other. And neither of them know. Neither of them know. They're speaking 2 different types of English at each other. I mean, this is happening all the time.
Well, I may have told you before, I mean, the cognitive psychologists or neuroscience people would say that's because we're really thinking with the emotional part of our brain, and our rational brain comes up with a reason to justify what we already believe. And so the people who believe not to wear them have, in a sense, very good rationales, because that's what that part of the brain does. The cortex comes up with the reasons.
I think that's part of that Behave book too, right? That the Harvard professor, I can't remember his name. It's on the book, but you have it there. Sapolsky, yeah. He probably covers that in that book, right? Like, I would imagine. I haven't read it.
Well, there's a lot of people who've addressed this stuff, and you know, they're kind of making it to the pop level. One would call it Descartes' error. the notion that the rational part is driving the other part, and it's like, no,
No.
the creature is going.
It's like the old thing, like the economic principle that people are rational consumers. You know, it's like, really?
Well, originally it was just an assumption, but then you get people into what's called a paradigm, which is what you're saying, the science paradigm, the political paradigm. The paradigm is a way of seeing the world. And so once you're in that, you forget the fact that it was just a convenient assumption, and it's like, this is right. And I did have a chance, maybe it was a decade ago now, to meeting on how do we assess the public good? What is good? And the benefit cost economics guy said, it's just benefit cost. I mean, it's the end of the discussion. I thought, I didn't know there were dogmatic people like that. I mean, I've heard about that, but the economists I knew weren't like that. They would simply say, it's just a tool. It helps to structure your thinking. It's not a replacement for thinking.
But a lot of people make that leap.
Once you're in the paradigm, you're in the paradigm.
It's a lot easier to navigate life not thinking about the complexities of it, right? Like your ability to introspect, your inability to introspect on your own introspection is like severely limiting, but man, does it make your life a lot easier, right? Like if I'm reacting to something, I know I'm reacting to this and this is the reason why, but can I take a step back and think, why did I think that way when this happened? Like people can't go to that level a lot of the time. And I think there's like a lot of research now about like athletes who really hit that success level can like cognate.
Well, that's what it comes down to, is not simply being reacting, but in a sense understand what it is that has made you react this way. And some of the people talk about that like second order learning. Yeah. Where you learn to learn, and part of the learn to learn is when you're doing something to step, I know I need to step back because I always fall into these things. And so you don't try to solve the problem the same way you've always been trying to solve it because it didn't work. And so you step back to say, that way of solving a problem was an effective strategy, but I didn't step back to see it was a contextually limited effective strategy. And then in other contexts, other
it would
things
not
need to be done.
apply.
Right, that's the metacognition
Like,
type
when
stuff.
someone doesn't understand me, it must be because they can't hear me, so I'm going to yell. In one context, it worked, but in this context, it's not the problem. It's not why you're miscommunicating.
It might work
because you're
sometimes.
coming from different paradigms, possibly. Yeah.
Indeed, that is. And so you could think about this whole stuff with regard to the fight about race, etc., is that, well, we have a certain mindset, it's a certain paradigm, and we've gotten comfortable in that. We don't really question the assumptions, which is to say, well, why is it you think this order is necessary and has to be this way? And so that becomes, a paradigm. When I grew up with it, it's like, well, this is the way it's always been. It has to be this way. Cornel West makes a big point of saying, you must make what is appearing to be necessary and instead see it as contingent. Necessary meaning, of course we have to organize society this way. How else can it be done? And the contingent is, well, it could be done this way, but in other contexts, if you really open your eyes and go to other cultures, you'll see it's done differently.
That's really hard.
Sex roles, things like that, the gender responsibilities, etc. How do you change that? There's a thing that says, it turns out women are becoming more comfortable with homosexual behavior than men are. And that the notion is, there was a certain paradigm that women were getting away from, the male being at the patriarch. And so they had more kind of models of saying, if I want to not be that, if I want to do feminism, this is one theory this person was saying, that the feminism itself broke down the necessity of the same kind of order that you probably saw when we lived in Utah.
That's like postmodernism, kind of like.
Well, that's right. It's deconstructing to realize all of this is a social construction. We have constructed these roles because they worked. Yeah. They were pretty good. But pretty good doesn't mean, necessarily the way it has to be. Right. There might be other pretty good ways of doing it.
Yeah, it's like there probably is a way to order things differently in a way that produces even better results, but how do we figure that out?
And one of the way they put that is you're going to a local optimal state, but not a universal optimal. In other words, within this little range of how you know how to be, you know how to optimize it. But there's a whole world out there that could get a higher optimization.
Right.
But we get caught up in that because we're always trying to optimize within the constraints that we live in. And some of the arguments is that's because we live in co-evolved systems. That all of these things about these role relationships, these responsibilities, all these skill sets, they all evolved in a way that reinforce each other. And you can't just change one piece without it being affecting the other pieces. And so the whole notion of system change, that is culture change as well, is that how do you do that? In the 1960s, the notion was just tear it down. But that's not really going to be the answer.
No.
Tearing down is easy.
Yeah.
The last 4 years have shown us what you can do. You can say, this was just BS. The fact the elite was doing all these things and not caring about us.
The populism.
Fair enough. It's good to tear things down. But you also have to recognize that if co-evolve means it co-evolves over centuries. And they became more refined, more of this and that. New things come in, new technologies. No longer being strong is important to be successful. You know, armies can be fought by people who are not terribly strong if it's all what's coming now with, you got drones and you're fighting with that stuff.
Drones,
so the whole,
for sure.
these things change.
There's going to be tech nerds that can fight wars.
Bless them. You know, let's hope ours are better techs. But that's, you know, it could well come down to that. But the point is, things shift, but not often in ways that we can do intentionally. It's very difficult to intentionally move a shift. And yet, it's those co-evolved systems that are the culture we talk about. And so that affects gender roles, it affects things with race roles, because the culture is a whole. And you change one piece of it and it messes up the other pieces.
Right. You empower, like, I think a big one is you've seen people react in very different ways when people are trying to empower black people. You have groups of white people that react in positive, or maybe positive is a bad word to put it, but because it puts there's a value judgment there, but you have people who are pushing back against it and other people who are pushing with it, right? Like they want to be a part of it, and other people are defensive against something like that, right? So I think of like Black Lives, like a perfect example is Black Lives Matter, right? That's like a thing. And then people are like, well, all lives matter, right? Like it's like, I don't want to support that. I have to support something else that I create. Or, well, blue lives matter. You know what I mean? It's this, you can't elevate one thing without having effects on the other.
Well, that's controlling the narrative.
Yeah.
And that's what I saw on an African American woman's car. It said, all lives will matter when Black lives matter.
There you go.
And it's like, don't get into this. Pro-life or pro-choice? Who doesn't want life?
Yeah.
Who shouldn't have choice? It's a way to, to try to, take command of the narrative. And again, to try to say, this is necessary.
Right.
And so, again, this notion of, well, how do you really try to change culture? Because just recognizing the wrongness of what the Black Lives Matter has recognized, well, what do we do? And, the kumbaya moment where all just sit around and be friends with each other, there's always going to be competition. How do you have what's quote-unquote fair competition? I mean, the whole idea of meritocracy is,
that's hard.
People work, survive and they work hard, and your mother worked hard and she's a success. Why isn't everybody? And so that meritocracy notion is used to be, well, what the heck else would you want it to be? You want it to be, how tall you are should be what determines how much money you get? No one's going to do that. So why not meritocracy? But baked into that is a whole co-evolved system as well.
Of like, well, we value these merits over others.
Yeah, and like, well, how is the society structured to give people a head start, as it were? It turns out things like Head Start and early Head Start do make a difference.
It's huge.
But they don't make a difference for if you or I would have begun with that, because we already had the supports that would have been made that either secondary or just an obstruction.
Like, what do you mean?
You had parents who were going to do for you to help you develop.
Right.
And it turns
or bail
out
you out if you go
the
to jail.
poor, they would, if you fail once, they put you back. You fail
Right.
twice, you get back.
Right.
I have high school classmates who did that.
Mm-hmm.
And they're very successful now because they've got second and third chances.
Right.
And so those supports are there because, like we talked about with Failure 101, you're going to fail sometimes.
Yeah.
And so if the rule is, if you're rich and you fail a few times, you get some more chances, but if you're poor, you fail, there's no one else to go to,
Right.
Who's going to give you money to try your next big idea?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I would have came out of the poor choices I made when I was young had I did not have that support system, or that we didn't live in, a place like Utah where the consequences were pretty low in terms of getting involved with something that, you
Probably
die
so.
from,
But you also grew up in a culture where I didn't understand and appreciate, where you were so different.
Yeah.
I mean, I never saw your mother as being black in the sense of that. I didn't see you that way. And so I didn't even really try to understand how it was for you to go to school every day with people looking up, he's that guy.
Yeah.
And what does that mean to be that guy? It could be some fun things about it, but sometimes that guy is given a few roles to play, and you're going like, well, holy moly, if that's what they want me to be, God, I can do
Yeah.
it.
Right.
And it's like, I'll show you I can do that.
Yeah, exactly. It's a weird kind of like, if you think I'm trouble, wait till you see this. You know what I mean? Like, you're already expecting me to be something, and
Yeah.
I think people don't. I think oftentimes if someone hasn't been through something like that, you're missing just how impressionable you are as a young person. And
What you respond to.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
just like, I wasn't necessarily as in full agency of myself as I am today compared to how much agency I had. It's not that people were telling me what to do or restricting me. It's like,
No,
I
we
just
told you plenty what to do.
yeah, I know. And then what did I? But yeah, you have hormones, you have physiological things that are changing for
Yeah.
you. You're still learning how to even socialize with people. I mean, the just the gap alone of trying to have a conversation with a child really at 18 is so different if you haven't been socialized really well intentionally. And
Well, but you also, whatever socialization you had before we moved from New Jersey, was a different socialization than what you were being thrown into, both in Illinois
Right.
and in Utah. And
Yeah.
it was like, well, who am I?
yeah,
There was some Japanese or Asian writer going like, I was told they really like my authenticity when I write as a, Asian writer, but I want to write as a writer.
yeah.
How do I be a writer without being in, the white writers don't think about that.
There's like a TV show that was on Hulu called Woke, and that's what it was like, a struggle with this guy. He's black and he's a cartoonist, or like he would draw things, and they were like, "Oh, you're that black comic," and he's just like, "No, I'm just a comic, man." And then he goes through some like racial profiling incident where he gets viewed as a criminal who he had nothing to do with, right? They saw a 5'10" black male with shaved head, and then he gets like hit. Police tackle him, they like arrest him, and he just starts freaking out, and then they're like, "Oh, wrong guy," and then they just leave him there, and he's just like, that traumatizes him, and it wakes him up. That's like the whole like premise of it, and he's like, "Oh man, no, I am a black I am a black cartoonist. What do I what do I do?" And it's like you see his like progression is trying to struggle with it. So at first I was like, man, what is this? But it's this guy from this other show and who played this guy named Winston. And I was like, oh, this is actually pretty damn good. And
I didn't know that one. Okay.
No, it's good. It's some of the TV that's coming out is interesting and challenging and talking about that stuff.
Well, we're getting more voices for one thing, and the notion that you could actually do that. We now have In the Heights. Following on Hamilton's success, and it's really about Washington Heights, and your mom knows that well. You got an Uncle Julie who lives up there, and what's it like up there? Well, instead of having the stereotypes you have, in certain kind of, let's say, spy movies where James Bond goes up and hangs out in Harlem, and that's what people say. Oh, okay, that's Harlem.
Yeah.
It's like no, and In the Heights is more of a. There's Dominicans and Puerto Ricans and all that stuff up there.
Yeah.
And, Emmanuel, was, Puerto Rican. He wanted to express, this is what I grew up like.
Mm-hmm.
And again, should you only do that? Well, he didn't only do that. He did Hamilton, which is not an obvious thing for a Puerto Rican to do.
Mm-hmm.
But so it was like, no, I am going to do this because I'm talking about something different. But now I want to express something that was personal to me. Your mother spent a long time avoiding getting involved in the sense of Hispanic public administration.
Mm-hmm.
She was a public administrator.
Right.
But at some point you start being pulled into, there are issues that I think I understand that need to be addressed.
Yeah.
And then it's like, well, that's not all I do, but I am going to do that.
It's tough. It's a hard thing to grapple with, right? Because a lot of other people don't have to think about it. Like, if you're in the majority, you don't really have to think about it.
Truly, growing up, I could go weeks without thinking about blacks much.
Yeah.
We had one black family in my school, and at some point they were older than me, and they graduated, and then there were none.
Yeah.
And so then we had some Jewish people. I probably didn't even know they were Jewish early on. By high school I did, but like in elementary school, being Jewish was like being, well, you're an Episcopalian, you're a Protestant, Catholic, you're Jewish. I mean, you're just one of these things. But no, that's an identity, and we wouldn't think it makes a difference. But if you were Jewish and this woke guy, and you either heard stories or experienced yourself being treated differently because of that,
Right.
Now it's part of your identity.
Right.
And again,
So weird.
I didn't have to ever think about those things. We've got a doctoral student doing a dissertation about black men. To what extent do they have difficulties or challenges to access to care? And these are men with diabetes. And some of the questions on this national, this statistical thing is, is it important to you to have a doctor who's the same culture as you? And then, have you ever felt disrespected because of your culture? And there's questions like that. And I've been to doctors of all kinds, and some may be more disrespectful to me than others, but it's never because of who I am.
Yeah.
It's not because of I'm my culture.
Or maybe it is because of you, but you don't have an antenna for that.
No,
You're
they
like,
might try to be disrespectful,
right.
but they know they can't get away with it.
Most of the doctors I've been to have been Indian, and I think they think I'm Indian at first.
Yeah.
So I think
Your
it makes
mother
it easy.
gets that too. Yeah.
You know?
No, I've been to quite a few of those
Yeah,
as
yeah.
well, but I don't think about it as being important to me. Why? Why should it be important to me?
Right.
I don't need them to understand my culture. They know my culture. They watch TV.
Yeah.
It's out there.
So when you were growing up in Cincinnati in the 60s, how did you come to, when did you start thinking about race? Do you remember a time when you were like, oh, there's
It
other
happened
people?
pretty early because it was a civil rights era.
That's what I'm,
You know, I was born in 54, so the civil rights stuff was 64 or 65. These things were being passed and being, at least on
Those
paper.
are formidable years, right?
Yeah.
Like that's your...
Well, there also were years in which there was a lot of upset. This is not just, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, but there were a lot of people who really were militant, the Black Panthers. And this notion of, well, you're not going to take us seriously when we act nice, so we got to do this. My town had only a little suburb had only a couple ways in, and one was a tunnel, and they seriously thought about putting a chain up so the blacks couldn't come in and ravage the town.
Ravage the town.
Didn't hear that word, but I'm sure
it was used.
That was, if it wasn't, it was still what it was meant.
Right.
Is that we want, we know what they're going to do, and so it was that kind of way. My mother was a Democrat. My father was probably a Republican. He never talked much about it, but they used to joke about how they would cancel each other out every time they voted, and so, presidential election. At times, she was the only person in not in the whole town, but when there was different voting districts within the town or sorts, and she was the only Democrat in there. And so they needed to have her, because you have to have both parties represented at the polling stations. And
so she was just roped in all the time.
Yeah. As your mother has been roped in for different reasons.
Right.
We need to have somebody with this perspective. Patria, tell us what we need to know.
Right.
You represent them. Right.
So did your mom ever talk to you about those types of things, or?
We had the proverbial, whatever, a cleaning lady, a black lady. And because we had gotten her, she probably came once a week or twice a week when I was young. More often when I was younger, and then later, less often. But they would come and they would, clean, and often my mother would be off at a meeting, and that woman would take care of me. This happened apparently a lot in the South, and mine might have been similar or different than how it was there. But that was my interaction with black people. It didn't happen at school. It was in having that person there. And so she meant a lot to me. Because of her working for our family, her husband also then got working for my father. And he became kind of the chief, not laborer, but kind of like the person who would be in charge of making sure things were ready for the jobs. So when the carpenters show up, it's all ready for them. Things like that. So those were the people I knew, and occasionally we would go to their house. And it was to that part of town. And that was where the blacks would live. And it was a very different kind of thing. But because of my mother, probably, and I won't claim that I was woke because I was so, woke in general.
Yeah.
But, probably because of that, I had a different sensibility. I went
the fact that you all went to dinner at their place is a huge thing. Like, I'm sure a lot of people had that same relationship, but never went to dinner at their place.
Well, it was always a little tense in the fact that we knew these two people who were like the matriarch, patriarch of the family, and they had children and at some point grandchildren, I think even great-grandchildren before I got out of there. But we didn't know them, and so it was a little awkward finding things to talk about, and I was still young, and so, we didn't have Pokemon to say, oh, do you do Pokemon? That everybody would say, yeah. I mean, if you were doing anything then, it would be sports, and I probably knew very little enough about what they would care about. And so it was a little awkward, but I knew those people, and I knew they cared about us, and we cared about them. I could go into all sorts of details about what that family went through, and us, and your mother and I, she got to meet them as well.
Oh, wow.
And so,
I seem to recall, like, one time when we went to Cincinnati to visit your mom, you went to go visit.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, that just jarred a memory right there, something that I hadn't even thought about. Like, I remember something like that.
Yeah, we'd given her one year, we gave her a little, well, not a Santa kind of thing, but something that would sing, songs and things like that. And at that point, her grandson had just died of AIDS.
Oh, no.
I mean, she just had this little toy that would sing songs, and it just gave her joy. And because, it was something to be, thinking about something more sublime than what her family, he was the great hope. He had gone off to a fine school, I forget which one, but one of the, really top schools, and he was in New York working for the news station, I forget, ABC, NBC, but he got AIDS and then died. Back then, it didn't take long.
Whoa.
And so, again, in the whole family, no one else was succeeding the way he had. Largely like your mother, no one has succeeded the way she has.
Yeah.
There always are those examples like that. And so that's the kind of connection we had with them, is that, they meant a lot to us in that sense. I would get emotional thinking about it now. The stuff they went through, because I had no knowledge of this.
At the time that it happened?
No, well, that too. I knew when he died, yeah. But I'm talking, that was later when your mom and I, went to visit her. I'm saying, like, when I was in high school and stuff like that, I only knew bits and pieces. I knew it was these people were over there, and we knew some, and they were good to us, and I spent summers working with the husband, the maid's husbands, worked, my father, I said, and so I would be his assistant in some of the summers. And so, he was my boss. And so, it was like, sure, this is, he knows what he's doing, all I'm going to do and try to help. But not everyone had that kind of exposure. But, at 14 or so, and I guess I was even probably still 13 at the time, 1968, it would have been when I turned, 14 in December. But it was, I was going door to door canvassing for Hubert Humphrey for president. And so, he was the Democrat against, well, do you know who he ran against? There's a guy named Tricky Dick.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say Nixon, but...
Nixon won in 68, then again in 72. All right. So anyway, so I got posters and things like that I could take home because we all had campaign materials. I put up a big poster in my room that I was allowed to do, whatever, and it was a big black face. I mean, we're probably this, 3 feet high. The whole poster might have been, 4 feet tall, or maybe it was 3.5, whatever. But it was big and it covered a lot. And it said, on the top it said, "Vote for you." Vote for HHH, Humphrey.
Yeah.
And so that was, that was like, of course.
Yeah.
We had some plumbers come one time. I think they were plumbers, people working on the house. And my mother was, really worried. And she took the poster down so that people wouldn't see that we had a black person up on the wall. And so, that I remember when I was 13.
Interesting.
As it turned out, the plumbers were black. I mean, that part I remember as well. So, that's what race was like in those days. There was a place in Cincinnati called Coney Island, which was like a miniature version of the real one. And it was a place for amusement park. And, carnies and stuff like that were probably there. Probably really riff-raff people running the place, quote unquote. But you go out. We used to go there, and I liked going there as a kid. You could shoot the little water into the thing and make the balloon pop, and then you get to take a little stuffed animal home.
They still have that same exact game. They haven't adapted anything.
No, I remember you and Peter playing that very game.
Yeah.
So yes, they still exist. But the point is, what's relevant here is that I grew up, and it wasn't until probably late in high school that I realized I'd never seen a black person there. They weren't allowed to go. This is in the mid-'60s, 67, 68. No, I didn't pick that up. As a 13-year-old and stuff, you go walk around and the people all look like us, so what's there to notice?
Yeah.
Fish and water.
Interesting.
And we went one time to a friend's wedding in L.A. and you were there. I think we all went. And Alexander was with us, and he was probably like yay high, maybe 3 or 4 years old, maybe 5. I don't know. I mean, he was obviously looking around. We're walking through L.A. Down by the pier and stuff like that, and he says, "Mommy, guess what? These people look like you." He came from Logan, Utah.
Yeah, that's right.
He never saw those
I don't think
people.
I went to LA with you guys for
You
that.
might not have. Peter was there for sure. You might have been already off in college or doing whatever you were doing.
Yeah, it's possible.
Or maybe you just were doing other stuff in high school.
Being a dick.
Well, I mean, we're all woke in our own little way. But the point is, that was for, you have these memories of like, oh, yeah. Now, I also remember stuff people, you would come back and say how people had, slurred you and things like that.
Happened all the time.
Well,
I tell people now it was not uncommon. So not to say that it was common, but
constant,
it was just,
but
like not to say it was like every day, but it was like when it happened, I wasn't surprised.
Well, we had the sense
like, oh crap, I
that you were looked at differently whenever there was a altercation, shall we say. Stabbing a kid with a pencil, maybe. But you were you're going to be the troublemaker. That's the role that's set out for you, and so it's not unusual to say,
right.
You calling me trouble? I'm Mr. Trouble, dude.
Wait till you see what's next.
This is Mr. Trouble here.
Yeah.
The role is just waiting for you. Take 3 steps and it's you.
Yeah, it's just weird because like I think at the time, I didn't like that I was in trouble. Didn't like getting into trouble, and I did devious things. Like I was just a mischievous high energy kid. I was never malicious. I was never like trying to hurt people intentionally.
Yeah, you were trying to hurt Peter all the time.
Not intentionally.
Every time you walk in the hallway, you'd bump him. This is being mischievous. Whack. So yes.
Okay.
So
outside of the family.
Outside the family, things were different.
Yeah, like I wouldn't like look for fights.
Yeah.
Like I wouldn't try to get physical with people.
No.
Like that was a very rare for me to get physical.
When you're surrounded by people who are not of your race, yes, probably a good idea.
Probably a good idea. Yeah, but it was weird because I remember thinking that I would just get attention for doing nothing. And then, I mean, that's just like bullying, right? But there was like an added layer to it where they're like, I know I can do this to you, and I know I can get away with it.
Oh.
You know what I mean? It's weird how, looking back on it, and I didn't think of it at the time, but they knew.
Yeah.
Like on some level, they had to know.
They're privileged.
Because, you told us that story about the counselor who watched me like because he lived right by us in Lamplighter in River Heights in Utah. And I was walking up the street, and the counselor lived on that block, and he saw people drive by. They don't hop out of the car, but they're leaning out of the car as they drive by, and they're just like, niggas! They just yell at me, right? Like, that was not uncommon for that to happen.
Yeah.
And he observed it, and he was like, what the hell? I think, and then he told you guys about it. Isn't that something like that, right?
Yeah, I remember. I forget the details, but yeah.
Yeah, and that, when I look back on those instances where people would do that to me, it's not that I look like somebody from Africa to them. They just know that I'm not them, and that they can say something to put me in a place that's lower than them.
Yeah,
because it's not nerd,
white,
right?
You're them,
right? Because it's not. You could say nerd, geek, doofus, piece of shit. You know what I mean? But
I can think of lots of
you can think of lots of things, but there was like an intention behind it.
Excuse me. Sorry.
Can you come back later? Excuse us.
Yeah. Something's happening with the microphone. It's making like a DJ scratch sound. Oh, it went away now. Maybe it was that. Oh, it's there again. So I can hear the conversation in my headphones.
Sure.
But yeah, it was like when I remember it, thinking back on it, it's like I don't think their parents told them that either. Like I don't think their parents were like, when you see this, do that. You know what I mean? I think, but it was just like some.
No, they would tell jokes about things like that.
Yeah,
I knew of jokes.
Right.
Growing up,
Yeah, and so they just knew that they could do it.
Yeah.
It was a way to get power over me, and I quickly learned like I can't get offended by that, because first time someone called me that was in 4th grade in Illinois when we moved.
Yeah.
And it was because at the time I was like pretty athletically inclined. I was just dexterous, and I had good hand-eye coordination. And I remember my team beat this other kid's team, but I was like the person that kind of helped drive the line over, because I mean in the area in Illinois there wasn't like a whole lot of coordinated kids. Remember you would tell me I would play basketball with these kids in New Jersey who were like crazy good, and then that was who I played with. So then when I moved to Illinois, it was like, dude, these guys are trash, I'm the king here.
Well, that's an argument for Abraham apparently came from a civilized area in the Bible. And so he comes to these people, it's like, I got some great stories. You guys haven't heard these stories?
Right. So I was like big fish, right? And then it was early after we moved, and this kid just like shoved me and was like, calling me racial slurs, and I was like, what the hell is that?
Yeah.
Because I didn't know, coming from New Jersey, that never happened.
They heard them at least. They didn't invent these things. No. It wasn't on YouTube at the time. This is way before.
Right.
So somebody in the community was saying certain things like this.
Because he was in 4th grade. He was in 4th grade.
Yeah.
And you had like, kids protesting with their parents back when like civil rights stuff was coming in. They're just like as aggressive and angry, and it's like they don't even know what they're talking about. They're like 5 years old, 8 years old, just like screaming. Yeah,
enlisting kids in these things is a little bit unethical, etc. But
it's creepy. It's scary and sad. It's really sad. Really, it's just pathetic. But I wonder, how did you? So you had this like bubble in a way that you grew up in, because you're in the Midwest-ish, or Cincinnati considered like East Coast?
It's Midwest. It's Eastern time zone, but nobody could call it East Coast. No one.
It's not quite East Coast. So you're in the Midwest. So
Pennsylvania's not East Coast mostly.
Yeah,
Philadelphia, sure, but Western. No.
Sure. So how did you then, I guess, mature in that regard? Because you ended up marrying someone who's Dominican.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's like a 30-year gap right there, right? For you, from being like 10-year-old, not thinking about that stuff.
In high school, though, I was already socialized. I told you by the time I was, just began at 13, I was canvassing. I did it again for McGovern in 72, but I was already taking on that role. That's who I was.
The Progressive Leftist?
Yeah, well, yeah, literally, I have it on my notebooks, and some people would rip them apart, they would not be, because it was like the kids you said, going to, protest. These kids didn't know jack what they believed in. They had no idea what Republicans but the Democrats were those people. And so some of us were those people. As luck would have it, most of the smart people were those people in school. I mean, quite literally, we had, honors, courses, and those people were that way. We didn't really hang out with the other people anyway. So
other people meaning like more conservative people.
Well, the people who really weren't that aware, cognizant of what's going on in the world and didn't care. They had their world, and it's like, do it. If you can score a touchdown, I'll clap for you.
Right.
But they weren't part of our world. There was a group of us that were more, quote unquote, elite in our minds, just as the other people thought they were elite in their minds, I'm sure. But
you were like more on the intellectual side.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's also because just like you're talking about roles, that was a role that was given to me. It was like, you want to do this? I'm like, I can do this.
Of course you can.
This is what's it. It's easy.
I remember I told someone recently that you said you used to be able to think straight for like 8 hours. I'm like, holy crap, I can't even imagine doing that. And you're like, well, you could probably do something for 8 hours.
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, but
I'm sure you have at times. Yeah.
I still do. But that's a lot of thinking.
No, when you're on something, it is cool. It's like starting a paper was always when I'd feel anxious. Once you do it, you're in it. You're in a groove. And just, I'm sure for computer programming, it's like that, I've got it now. This is the elegant way of doing it or something like that. And you kind of see a path and you want to do that. So that's what our group was, those people who were thinking about the outside world. And it is not unlike the people now talking about, well, you East Coast elitist, you globalist. A globalist now is being a sense of, well, you're bad because we think all humans are humans.
All right.
It's like, well, who's your tribe? We're the human tribe. And so we were already thinking in those terms.
Yeah.
Of course we wanted to, go see other cultures and experience these things.
Do you think that was a byproduct of your curiosity or your peers, or probably a mix of things, right? Like,
I probably had a fair number in my social studies of somewhat leftist social studies teachers. This is what big half of the country gets upset about.
Right.
The big thing now they're fighting about is critical race theory.
Yeah.
In schools, all they did in this one in Maine was like, we think what would happen with, this Black Lives Matter was right, that what happened to George was wrong. And it's like, oh, you're trying to indoctrinate our students. Well, they are.
Yeah.
It's like Colbert would talk about how, well, this is what they say in liberal history, which is also called history. So in our minds, that's what the world was. And so we were thinking, we're, global about different cultures, different people. I didn't really experience many other cultures till I went to college. I went to Georgia at first, and being in the South was a whole new experience.
Yeah.
And you realized, this is a separate issue in the sense of versus race, but this whole notion of the Civil War, no one in the North ever thought about that.
No, because they won.
That's right. When you win it, you don't think about it.
Yeah.
We have movies of Rambo because we lost.
Yeah.
It's like every bridge had said this was a battle of this thing back in 1865 or something like that. That was their mindset, and it's reinforced with them. So that was a shock to me. It was also a shock to be around a lot of New York Jews. That's where they came down because it was
in Georgia.
At Emory was known for being a good medical school. And most of my friends were Jewish people from that region. And if you were from New Jersey, you were a second-class citizen. Like, my father lived in New York once.
Yeah.
But that was like, there was a certain hierarchy there of having that kind of awareness, not worldliness. And so I got exposed to that, which was useful. But then I went to grad school, of course, in Hawaii for 8 years. And that's a lot of different cultures. And as a therapist, I was trained to try to do family therapy with people from different cultures, which means you're supposed to be culturally responsive to this. And I won't say that I was very good at that because it's not easy,
Oh, that's be super hard.
Well, some of the times it was let's say a Japanese adolescent boy or girl, and they come to family court because they're acting up in certain ways. The parents are upset. They they want to put them in detention home, which they had one called that. And you have in the family, what's wrong with them? And they've moved to Hawaii now. They've been there, let's say 5 years. I don't know, whatever. And they say, well, the kid's becoming too American. And so culturally responsive, I would really try to understand what that was like.
And then your next patient is a Filipino
Yeah.
who, it's like
Well,
totally
some
different.
were part Hawaiian
Yeah,
also, and they
Hawaiian,
had a
yeah.
whole different thing. And I didn't understand how it was so critical for them to really be hard on these things, because they felt if they weren't really hard on them,
Mm-hmm.
they would end up being worthless.
Mm.
And you can probably extrapolate that to what some people in your family
Oh, for
might
sure.
have gone through.
Uh-huh.
If you don't keep your act together,
Mm-hmm.
stuff happens.
Right.
And that was never for me.
Yeah.
You know, like you said, you didn't have to worry about things
It definitely
falling
seems
apart.
to be a trope of historically oppressed people, right? Like people who had to,
Marginalized,
who had to make do with other people who are in power who can cast judgment on you really easily, because you have to be on your best behavior.
Yeah.
Otherwise, like, they will punish you.
Yeah, I'm
You
not sure
know?
the Japanese felt that way. Some of them might be very high-level people, and executives, et cetera. But a lot of those groups were marginalized, so that they were already, denigrated.
Mm-hmm.
If you met people from, let's say, Tokyo University with a PhD, you're not going to say, "Oh, do you feel like you're kind of marginalized?" Before all this stuff in the last couple of years with anti-Asians,
Mm-hmm.
no one thought of them as being an oppressed group.
Right.
They might have felt that way because of all the pressures of being this and that and et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
But we wouldn't have thought of them that way, whereas the other groups, they clearly saw themselves as being oppressed like that. Hawaiians, until about the time I was there, they had what they called the Hawaiian Renaissance, and they were considered second-class citizens. And you
In their own state?
Well, it wasn't exactly their own state anymore.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, they were a minority.
You know what I mean? Yeah.
But it was their own thing, and so one song that we play a lot from the Makaha Sons of Ni'ihau was about that. What would the king and queen say if they came back here? But the point was,
That's a beautiful song.
it's a wonderful song and sung in whatever
It's really
well.
sad.
But the point is, that was that culture, and I didn't know that culture. I tried to get to know it. In my dissertation work, I was working at a school for kids of Hawaiian ethnicity. And so eventually you get better at this. But when I first got thrown into being a therapist with that, you didn't know how to be culturally responsive. In my field now, that's a whole thing. And we're going to have a set of podcasts, we hope, then on culturally responsive evaluation. How do you not impose your values? Because when you evaluate something, just like you said, this notion of what's a good leader or whatever, we know what good leaders are like. They're like this. Well, the same thing happens in evaluation. The person who gets to set the criteria of what's good gets to control the game. And so how do you try to make sure that what you're evaluating is actually picking up on their strengths, not just the fact that they have a deficit of your kind of strengths? And that becomes a challenge. But that's just this arc you're talking about.
Microphone, something's happening there. Getting some weird feedback. Sorry, it's like a DJ scratching right in my ear while you were talking, and it.
Well, let me put it up there, and maybe
painful.
that's less scratching, perhaps.
That's so hard to do. That's so hard to do.
It is. It's a work in progress always. I'm better now than I was before, and I hope to be better in 5 years. I hope you get better each time as to what that means with different cultures. There's a lot of different cultures out there that you haven't experienced, that you wouldn't understand why these traditions are important. You might think they're just BS, but they're what keep the structure together.
Yeah, well, I grew up as an outsider.
That you certainly did.
So my natural disposition, because of that, is that most traditions are BS.
Yeah.
But that's coming from an outsider perspective, who the con was that I didn't have a foundation to identify with in terms of culture. That's why when I was in Utah, I didn't have Dominican culture to understand myself with. I didn't have it was my Dominican culture was when my grandma came to visit, and we would finally speak Spanish in the house, versus like my cousins who have Dominican family all over them. They're, even though they don't live in the Dominican Republic, they're inundated in.
No, your mother will tell you that Luce, she deliberately didn't go to those areas. She did not live, and it was like up in Rhode Island. There were a lot of Dominicans as well, but also up in the Heights, where Julie does live. you know, and so she deliberately didn't want to be surrounded by that. Well, that does make a difference, and this is what I'm still now coming to understand what that's like in the sense of it. I had a Zoom session with a colleague who's doing stuff on culturally responsive evaluation in New Zealand, and she's part Maori, and you know, it's just this whole thing about she knows the loneliness of a Maori guy who comes into a room and he's the only Maori and no one else knows.
Yeah.
And she was saying, just like you're saying, you know, if you had a couple people of his culture there, she was saying, well, if you're in a meeting and people are saying BS, you kind of look at each other and you go like, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I know. We all know that this is what's going on.
I think the benefit, at least in the United States and especially in San Diego, is that your relationships can transcend family and culture, which is a huge benefit and a huge boon for people. But the con of that is that, you know, your family and those culture can really protect you and insulate you.
Yeah.
But then obviously there's a con to having those familial bonds so close, is that it's hard to break out of the rigid confines of what your family sees as
that's the downside
important. Yeah, there's like pros and cons. So as the outsider, the pro for me is like I can look at a lot of traditions and be like, that's not efficient. Like that's this and like, that doesn't make sense. But I also don't have the benefit of being like, oh yeah, I'm this and this is what we're practice, because I don't know what that's like. You know, a lot of the traditions that we have are just what I see as nuance to our family, not necessarily some bigger ethnic thing that we do.
Well, this is the Myers-Briggs things, the P and J though. You know, the P's tend to think, oh, there's a lot of ways of doing things. Yeah. And the J's are going like, you know, why do you want to do it wrong? You know, don't you get this? I mean, you get pleasure doing things wrong?
Right.
But P's don't see it that way. And so that's another aspect of it, is that, well, maybe, you know, it's good to appreciate what, you know, people who feel you need to do it this way. Stuff falls apart. And that's the whole notion about why culture change is so difficult, is that if you start changing a few things, it's like, what was that game, like, you know, Stacks or something, and you get
Jenga.
to pull Jenga, you pull this little thing out, and you pull that, because that's not needed. Pull this one out, but at some point,
it just all topples.
Yeah, and the United States looks a lot like it really went through some of that in the last 4 years.
All right.
We've got no sense of common purpose. You know, there's the division is so strong now, and all the things that we thought kind of held us together, and for a lot of people, it's like, well, criminy, at least we used to be able to, say the Pledge of Allegiance and sing the, the hymn, the American anthem, and it's like, for other people, it's like, well, that's the most silly part of America. What the heck is that as common bounds?
Right.
I thought we were common bounds in the sense that we tolerate everybody and we're all equal. Right. That's what we have in common. And it's like, no, that's not what we have in common.
It's really hard because we actually don't talk about what it means to each other to be American.
Yeah.
And even though we all...
Because it's obvious.
It's obvious, duh. Don't you know?
Yeah.
Don't you know what it means? It's that whole national anthem or saluting the flag. I remember I had a huge issue with that as a kid because it would force me into tradition that I didn't really understand at the time.
Yeah.
Like, although I grew up in America, especially, like now I have a lot of pride for where I live.
There's a lot of good. I mean, a lot of BS, but there are a lot of worse places.
Dude.
A lot of places think they're really good at being multicultural, and then they have some other people show up.
Yeah, right.
And it turns out it's not so easy.
Yeah, Dominicans, definitely not a super multicultural area. Like, I remember, like, usually when I go there, they're like one of the first things people will say, like, "Oh man, you look Arab," but like in a way that's like, is that bad? Like, is that why is that a point of conversation for you? And even my own family, they've done that to me. Like it's not like a super tolerant culture for different ethnic groups, and they definitely prioritize light skin over.
Well, there's been a lot of issues about that. Not everyone who's we call people of color want to be called people of color. They want to say, no, I'm not a person of color. Those people are.
Right. Yeah.
So, how do you get some kind of commonality and common purpose? Well,
I have struggled with that, and I think at least the way I've approached things, especially as I communicate about like the diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, whether at work or in person, is to slow people down a little bit, because I think oftentimes they want a lot of action and things to happen, but there's a lack of context and understanding of what you're really getting into. So you're doing all this energy that's doing something, but then it's like there's a lack of focus. So
Yeah.
you end up wasting a lot of energy, or damaging yourself in the process, or other people, because you didn't take the time to just slow down and be like, well, what is actually happening? What is going on? An analogy is like, we saw this kid at the gym today, Xander and I, and he's committed. We've seen him there 2 days in a row, but he is just doing so many things wrong, right? Like just overworking himself. And it's like, what is all this damage that you're doing along the process of trying to achieve your goal? You're doing a lot of activity, but it wasn't thoughtful in its approach. So like some examples.
Well, thoughtful is part of it, but also just not competent.
Not competent, yeah, it's a huge part of it.
Because, you can be thoughtful and you think a lot about it, but it's not good thoughts.
Yeah.
You don't know what you're doing.
Or you haven't shopped it around enough to get perspective from other people. You're just like, you're pissed and you want to take action. And some like examples as they relate to, especially the last year, this one buddy of mine, there's not a whole lot of black climbers. Right?
Oh, okay.
Not a whole lot. And
I didn't think about it.
But I've talked to a few. I hung out with a couple of black climbers, and we talk about race, because it's like, this is the time, right? Where it's like, we're cool, but let's talk about this. Like, we don't talk about this. Shouldn't we be talking about this, right? So I'm talking about this with this one guy, and he's like, yeah, so I went to a protest, and it was about this guy, a homeless guy who was killed by the police. They came to protest, and he was black, homeless man who was killed by police. So it was like, we want to do Black Lives Matter. Then the protest leader started turning on like onlookers who weren't participating in the protest, but like getting hot dogs or something at the stand. So all of a sudden you have a mob of people that you've like incited, you got them riled up, and then you're like, if you're passive and you're not joining us, you're the enemy.
You're
and
part
people
of the
are like,
problem,
that makes sense. So it's like all this activity over this cause, but not a whole lot of like forethought. And he said when he was in there, he was like, this is becoming dangerous and stupid. Mostly just stupid, and nothing bad happened out of it, but he just recognized, like, I need to leave. And so...
counterproductive is just like a tame way of saying it, but whatever.
Right. So I think it's like slowing people down to just, think about what it is they're actually trying to do, and how is their actions going to affect change, and what are the implications of that. Change.
Well, that's what I'm trying to think about, is that
I don't know what the answer is.
In a sense, in evaluation, the whole focus is on improving things. Improving society is a big part for much of evaluation that we deal with. You could also evaluate shoes, but that's not what we do. But our association is mostly about making the world, social world better, addressing quote unquote social problems. Now, to do that, you have to have a notion of what's better. And the whole idea of culturally responsive evaluation is that what's better in one context may not be better in another context.
No.
So how do you know that what you're doing is better? And we don't have a good answer to that.
No.
And so it comes down to, if there's no agreement on specific kind of values of, well, the most important value is this, and the most important value is loyalty. I mean, there's a guy done stuff, and it's gotten somewhat controversial, and I'll talk with you about this, but moral foundation theory is the notion that originally there were 5 basic things that kind of push people.
Who's that? Who?
I probably got the book up there someplace.
It's not John Haidt, is it?
Yeah, that's him.
That's him?
Jonathan Haidt, Haidt. Yeah. And so he had 5, then there's 6, it turns out, because things like, equality is interpreted differently by conservatives and liberals.
Oh yeah, that's a huge one.
And so the notion there, though, is that, well, if we can't agree that which of these are the most important, because remember, in evaluation, you're going to have certain things that drive what is better. But if you have a notion of better that's different than mine, how do we deal with that? And our evaluation association is becoming more progressive. It always was, and conservatives have felt uncomfortable there. Do you really want to have an association that's meant to be going after betterment that is mostly only one part of it, to mean Who are we excluding, and how do we know that that's what we should be doing? So the notion then, and this is going to sound, kind of wonk and geeky, but are there in a sense meta level values that are really underlying all of these things? What makes things better?
I mean, I would believe that there are those meta values, but you have to talk about them and you have to engage with them and through discomfort, because but that's really hard to do.
Because trying to explicate them, you're going to get it wrong 12 times, and maybe the 13th time it's a little better. Because we don't know. It's, the ineffable.
Right.
And yet we want to try to be, to explicate it, to really bring it up, to say, this is a better way to guide stuff. Some of the things that are focused on out there are there's kind of two sides of the same coin. Basic needs theory, and that's saying there really are basic human needs. And so if you have a good society, to what extent does it take care of people's basic human needs?
Is that like the hierarchy of needs? Like by
It's
Maslow?
kind of like a Maslowian thing. They've all gotten away from that, even though Maslow clearly had some of the things right. But people react because it wasn't really empirically done, et cetera, et cetera. And so I know the criticisms, but they try to figure these things out. That can you talk about what is it to be a fully active human? And to what extent do societies, both facilitate and allow for that? And so part of allowing for it is allowing to be expressed. And so one of the things they talk about as being a basic need, besides the more physiological ones, is participation. You get to be, a full participant in society. And then they say, well, then there's what's called autonomy. Is the other one they talk about. Autonomy means you get to do what you want to do. But for both of those things, participation and autonomy, there's an angle of it that's critical. A critical autonomy means you actually know outside your bubble that there's lots of different ways to be, and you get to choose from those, not just from the 4 different jobs that you know about in your community.
Right.
There's that. And that's considered critical. You can look and say, oh, I see how that was thought was the only 4 options for a good wife to be, but there's other ones because you now have that. Critical participation is also, you don't just get to participate, but you get to actually have an impact on the society you're in, the subgroup you're in.
That's a scary notion if everybody had critical participation.
Well, but the whole point of it is possibly it's the people whose needs are not being met who are being most aggressive right now.
Right.
My needs are pretty much met, and to my, I tell your mothers that, people who are really happy are rarely the ones who are mean. Because, well, why would I bother doing that?
Yeah, I agree with
My
that.
needs are met.
Yeah.
And so, in some ways, if we could get to a society that understands needs, though, the problem is no one set of needs is going to apply to everybody. There's a notion in 1950s psychology, personality psychology. What was the guy? Henry, whatever, it'll come to me, was one of the guys. But it's this notion that it goes like this, and they used it, man was their way of, I'll always say person instead, because this is 1950s. Every person is in some respects like all other people. Every person is in some respects like some other people. And then, in any, however level of, whatever you want to talk, every person is in some respects, like no one else.
Yeah, like no one else. Yeah.
And that captures the whole dilemma, is that we can talk about our society. We all have certain similar needs. Oh, we can talk about different cultures within society having one. Oh, but then there's different subcultures within that culture.
Yeah.
And then you have this and that, and then, to say, well, you're a person of color, so you have these needs. And so this is coming up in articles that come to us, manuscripts, and they say, we want to talk about this way of saying, of these people who are like in detention homes of adolescents, we want to look at the people of color because they have different needs than the people who are white. And that's this notion. In some ways they do.
Yeah.
But within that, there's a lot of people that are going, I'm not like Jim at all.
Right.
You know, what are you talking
And
about?
then to others, they're a homogenous group of troublemakers.
Yes. But that's the notion that you got to play with as a society.
Yeah.
How do you recognize that and have policies
That's
that
so
allow for this applies to everybody? It's not whether you're, you know, what old versus not. You got to go the speed limit.
Right.
You know, so certain things we say do that for. How do we have certain groups?
It's almost like you can't get away from someone getting marginalized through the decisions that you make. It's very difficult to do.
Well, that's another piece of it is, and I could go into this whole economics thing about the fact of benefit cost analysis tries to, you know, increase the aggregate utility of a society. But in itself, it does not distinguish who wins and who loses.
Right.
And in almost every action in society, you know, you're building a highway. Some people win. They liked going to get free. Well, some people, you know, their community was torn apart.
Right.
And there's no more, you know, a sense of cohesion anymore. And so that is a problem. And the issue with race is that almost always the people who are of the elites, their losing doesn't get tolerated.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
It's the people who are down there that we're thinking they should be the ones to put up with some sacrifice.
Right.
This economics, this is an article that came out in our journal a couple issues ago. And they were upset because they're not allowed to randomly assign people to different conditions anymore for policy experiments. And one that I was, you know, involved, I was running the evaluation. Now we randomly assigned people to traditional Social Security insurance, you know, SSDI disability insurance, and people who had a new version that allowed them to work more without having their benefits cut off instantly.
Okay.
We randomly assigned them. Okay, and they're writing about that. And it's now with equity as opposed to equality. Randomly assigning works for equality because everyone has an equal chance.
Right. That's the whole random thing. Yeah.
But equity, no, because some of the
Equity's
people
different.
most in need get put into the condition that we really are hoping is not as good as the new condition, because that's why we wanted the new condition. We're thinking that this drug is better than the old drug, or whatever you have, this policy is better than that. And so random assignment means some of the people in the one that we don't think is as good, where, you know, that's our belief going in, well, otherwise why bother, that might be the worst off. And yet some of the people who are better off are in the better condition. That's not equity. All right, so that's becoming a bigger issue. Now get this though, the economists in their article say it's really, you know, inefficient to get rid of that, because we could have come up with higher quality evidence if we were allowed to randomly assign. Now you see what they're doing? They're allowing some of the people in low bad off to lose, because for the sake of what they call efficiency, we've got good knowledge. Why don't you try doing that with rich people? We're going to randomly assign who gets to have this level of taxes and who gets that one.
Right.
Because we need to know this thing, so they should sacrifice for us, shouldn't they? Good luck
No
being
way.
allowed to do that.
Right.
But they don't see that is a, it's like, well, you think that's what efficiency means, is that trumps everything else. And this is why every university has, you know, institutional review boards to say,
The IRBs.
IRBs, yes, are certain people being, you know, disadvantaged because of what you're doing.
Right.
And that's why the Social Security Administration is not able to randomly assign now. So again, this is notion of the marginalized people, their pain tends not to be seen as well as the elite. This issue about the Juul cigarettes,
Yeah.
I told your mother this, I read some of this, they're saying, the company Juul thought it was doing great. It says they didn't realize, you know, how angry, you know, how tough it can be to go up against rich parents. Going up against the poor ones, but the rich parents were going like, I got lawyers, I got this, my kid's doing this stuff,
Yeah.
we're going after you, you're going down.
Yeah.
And they had to back down because they went after the rich. I mean, you know, everybody was smoking Juul.
With resources, right? If you go
They
after
have the
people with
resources, and the resources include the social resources, the connections.
That's
I know
true.
the district attorney, I mean, we're going to do something, our state's going to put something in action. You know, I think the actual saying was, you know, hell hath no fury like rich parents.
Right. Or maybe white rich parents too.
Well, that too, but I bet even there
Yeah,
were
I
a
bet.
few.
Yeah, I
You
bet.
know, there were probably some Indian parents and stuff like that were pretty upset with this.
Right.
And again, they had money, they had connections. But yes, being white, it's got to be one extra thing, and that's that intersectionality, etc.
It's so hard. I really don't know what the answer is, because I don't think there's ever going to be an answer, but
But you have to come up with answers.
yeah.
And so my effort to come up with these meta values stuff is never going to be right. And when you preface the statement on this, one of these days when we're not moving, I'm going to try to write more about, you know, I get to put things in my journal that's called editor's notes. And I get to say what I want to say.
Yeah.
And so I was working on this for a while, and I've got some drafts, but it's also, you start off with this notion of, we're not going to get it right. All we need to do is to get it to be actionable, which is to say better than what we've been doing in the past. And so the idea of that is, it's only in trying something that you do make a little progress, and someone will say, but you didn't get all the progress.
Yeah.
Got it. But
Yes, thanks.
what you can learn, though, is how we could have gotten better progress. And it might not be what this person was sure would work.
Right.
Because it's easy to have an idea that, you know, if only they'd done this.
Right.
If only we had dropped a nuclear bomb on Vietnam, we would have won.
Right.
Well, that's probably a stupid idea. But, you know, and again, unless you have proof of it, and this was the, you know, they're getting off astray, but this was the whole notion of like the Iraq War. The neoconservatives had forever been saying, if you just had the guts to go and do this, we got the military, let's just go remake the map.
Yeah.
And it'll all be solved. And you can talk to each other for years saying this until you try it out.
And then you try it
and the
out.
same thing is true of trying to have a more equal society. Well, you just got to do this. And you can believe that until it's tried.
Yeah.
All these things were going to be this way. Samantha Powers was a UN representative under Obama at one point, and she was saying, like, we've got the power, let's go fix things. And so one of the things they didn't do, and they were, you know, the whole thing like Rwanda during the Clinton thing was a big deal, and the idea that they kind of made up for it by going after Kosovo and saving them from the Serbs, you know, right? And so there were all these different genocides that Samantha Power, who's now, by the way, in charge of USAID, but she wanted to do it. She was sure they would work, and why wouldn't Obama do it? And he was reticent. Sometimes he went along, and one of the ones was, if we just go bomb Libya, we can cause this thing to be solved.
Yeah.
It's going on today still.
Yeah, that's still like a human catastrophe.
Yeah. Yeah, they didn't ask for us to help them in that way. We screwed up because our intervention wasn't really understanding the context. And that's the whole thing, is that if you're doing this evaluation stuff, how will this intervention mesh with what's already there in the culture? And so all these efforts to try to deal with the poor, are interventions meshing with the existing cultures, or do we have this idea in our head of what rational people would do if we get this intervention? Why wouldn't they get better? But we don't have that connection. And so, in a sense, you're trying to put something into a system that's not consistent with the system. How do you try to get better at that? Because there's a whole thing now about system theory. In one of these videos I could show you about sustainability, this guy's talking about it, and it's always big. But it's the notion is, like I said, systems co-evolve. If you're trying to change to a electric, kind of a economy versus a fossil fuel one, you say, well, let's go after the oil companies. Okay, we can change that. Oh, but did you understand the power of the chemical companies who end up creating better, kind of mixes of petroleum and things like that? And they find better catalysts for kind of coming down to this. Oh, that's a whole industry. Are you dealing with the trucking industry that moves the stuff around?
Yeah.
Are you dealing with this industry? They've all co-evolved, and the expression is called it's locked in. You can't change this one part. You got to change the system. We don't know how to change systems, but the same thing happens in culture change, is that you want to have a culture where we're all more equal, but it's all co-evolved. You're going to take away the fact that my kids can go to a decent school because now you're going to have school funding being the same for the whole state.
Yeah.
No, you don't get this. Talk about elite parents having power. How do you get people to give up certain things? And one of the other doctoral students was doing a dissertation on things in Saudi Arabia. How do you get system change where women can drive cars? That's now allowed. I mean, but, you know, everything you change is going to be related to something else. And so you've got a coherent system that works by itself. But when it gets into new situations, it's not working in the modern era. Now, I don't know how true it was, but the understanding when we were doing the family therapy was that in Samoa, the Samoan, you know, adolescent men, you know, were kept in place because of the culture. They would be shamed by people. They come to Hawaii or to the U.S. or whatever, and they don't have that social structure anymore. Now, that's not to excuse, to explain or whatever, but that was what was told about that, and there's probably at least some grain of truth to that. Within the culture, it worked. And the same kind of stuff, you know, you look in Utah, the people are all part of one culture. And within that culture, they all do take care of each other. But what do you do if you've got a more heterogeneous culture and that falls apart? And then, you know, well, you know, how do you decide, are we really going to take care of him who's not one of ours? You know, and the same thing has been happening. Ireland's dealt with this. They were always thinking, because they were downtrodden during, you know, the potato famine, et cetera, and they came to America. They were hated as second-class citizens. And they thought they were more, you know, enlightened about this. But then some blacks started moving into neighborhoods, and things got destroyed, things like that. It's like, sounds easy to change cultures.
Right.
It was something that this guy, Pat Moynihan, who died, I don't know, maybe, it wasn't terribly long ago, maybe a half dozen years ago, a Democratic senator. He was an early person as a social scientist looking into this whole problem of the underclass and kind of saying, you know, it's not working because these things are happening. And he got, in his mind and most people's, I mean, the people we know's mind, he was misinterpreted as blaming it on the victims. You know, he didn't see it that way because he was a, you know, Irish Democratic Republican from Massachusetts. He has this saying, and I was thinking about buying a, you know, a little poster of it or something where he says, the great conservative truth is that culture, you know, affects society more than politics. You know, the culture is what really makes the difference. Politics with this and that stuff, but the culture is what makes a society have certain values, not values. It says the great liberal truth is that politics can change culture to save itself. And so, you know, there's that kind of yin and yang. You want to have a more equal society. You want to have a sustainable society. We're not really good at doing system change.
No, not at all.
And that was the whole 60s stuff, which is why today's generation that says, we're just going to be woke, you know, we're going to do this stuff. Why don't you get it? And it's like, well, you might be right. But I knew people who were just as enlightened as you, and they said, they were the most woke people in history in the 60s. Who would have been more woke than them? And yet we don't look at them in the same way now.
Right, that's some old time shit.
And now the people who are woke, well, in 30, 40, 50 years, what are you going to look like? And maybe they will be forever. But the idea of saying, well, yeah, they thought they were woke. And yeah, the people in the 1940s thought they were woke. And the people in the 20s, but what? But this time it's different. We're right. Maybe, but probably not. But how do we really get it right? Because we saw a lot of stuff of trying to tear down the walls, the system, and there was a lot of BS. But getting it to build up something new that's better, it was tough. You know, you had communes trying this stuff. You had this kind of thing. But you come into the fact that we're still humans. We're still competing for resources. We still want our progeny to succeed. And we're not in an easy place of helping meet everyone's needs. And so it becomes a competition and a bit of a zero-sum game.
You know, I was just talking to Alexander.
He's yelling for us now, but yeah.
Oh, well, we'll probably wrap up here in a minute. But I was talking to him during the trip about, because he doesn't know much about like postmodernism, which when I went to college in the University of Utah, in a communications degree, I was inundated with postmodernism and critical race theory, and on a big level at the time I bought into it, but I took from it something totally different than what's I think most people take out of it from their classes today, at least that's what it seems like to me when I see the reactions. And I notice that a lot of the current like woke individuals aren't aware that a lot of their philosophies are coming from ideas from postmodernism, which has been around for quite some time, and they've had
the
like
50s or something like that.
Right. It's been around for a while, but it's now steeped into the mainstream kind of thought. But so you're arguing about things that you don't understand the foundation of where it came from.
Yeah.
And part of it
you
is,
like the implications, but
right, and part of it is this, one of the big things is deconstruction. You talked about it, is that you're destroying, not destroying, that's not what deconstruction like uses, but I'm using it as a reference, like the wall, right? You destroy the wall. But then the challenge is like, well, then what do you rebuild?
Yeah.
And I learned about postmodernism in a way to deconstruct conflict through the conflict resolution class that still impacts me today.
Yeah.
We would deconstruct the conflict, but then we would rebuild the relationship.
Yeah.
But not like, it wasn't like therapeutic in a sense. We would rebuild it because the two people, we ask them questions so that they can deconstruct the narrative that they're coming to the conflict with.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds pretty critical. Yeah, that's a very, if you can do it right.
Right. It's incredible to see people like move away from conflict, or at least the positions or things that they tell themselves about the other people.
Yeah.
And when it really starts to click is when you're no longer talking and they are negotiating back and forth. Yeah. And then they reconstruct their dynamic.
Yeah.
I think that
that's what family therapy does too, basically. There's conflicts of adolescence for the parents, and they have to just change what this fight is about.
Right.
And you and I had our battles, and we never really had that discussion because of that therapy, of having a good family therapist get us to do exactly what you're saying.
Well, also, you have to have willing parties.
If you, under the right circumstances, you would have been more willing.
Probably. Probably.
Somebody who really knew how to do that, but it's tough.
That would be hard.
It's tough to find people, and when it would work for family therapy is when you got them on the emotional level. And so to me, that's when you get this notion of what conflict negotiation would be. Talk on a level, on an emotional level, and that goes right back to what we were saying at the very beginning of this with regard to Descartes' error of if you rationally change your thoughts, the rest will change.
No.
And that's probably not happening.
No.
And the same
My
thing,
list of good and bad reason for this.
Yeah.
Okay, why should I not smoke pot?
Yeah.
And then I remember I wrote some lists like that at like 18, and I had this big long reasons of why I shouldn't and then why I should.
Yeah.
And then I was like, yeah, I'm going to go smoke
But I
some
want
weed. Like, 18, 19 or something years old.
I'll tell you a little about this story I read. It was like a one-page, or maybe a column in the New Yorker, and it was about this guy, and I'll elaborate more, but he comes up to a traffic light, and he's on his way to see his best friend's wife, and because she's been a little bit flirtatious, etc. And he's thinking about he's where this is going to lead. He says it's going to do this, we're going to end up doing that, and stuff like this. It'll blow up. My wife will do this with the kids. It'll be like this, and this will happen. The light changes, and he keeps going. And that's the notion was, he went through the whole routine of all the bad things is going to happen, and he just keeps driving towards this rendezvous. And so that's what we do. And again, that's why we don't deal with race relationships well. We come up with all these sorts of things, but I want my kids to succeed. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I like you guys, but my family is different.
My family comes
And
first.
it turns out that that's what my tribe is different. I like the other people, not my tribe, but you're not my tribe. And that that's on an emotional level.
Well, I hope that in some way I can impart on other people who want to tear things down to help them realize that they have to rebuild something.
Well,
as
that's
well.
what the existentialists did, and I think they were part of the threads that went into modernism.
Yeah.
Was that they were breaking down these things like, you act as if this is right. Existence precedes essence was this notion of we're here. All these things you claim to have essence, that's what we've constructed.
Yeah.
And so that part was right, but it was more difficult. If those things aren't meaningful, How do you create new meaning?
Yeah.
And to me, and I was pushing it with Camus. Camus was better than that at Sartre than Sartre. Sartre was the more academic one, so he would win those kind of academic debates. But when you read Camus' writing, he's talking about how people do create meaning, and you find that in such a way, and I think that's the powerful part. And if you get people to deal with those basic human needs, in other words, it's not just food, it's not just companionship, but how do you get them to get to whatever their meaning is? And this is not, I think it was Rollo May, of the psychodynamic therapist, and it would call the will to meaning, not the will to power, but the will to meaning. People need meaning in their lives, and there's lots of literature about that, have shown that exactly stuff. I've probably told you, and you've already read Wild Duck. That's what Wild Duck was about, the Ibsen play.
I didn't read it.
Well, you read the Dollhouse, didn't you? You read some of the Ibsen stuff, I'm pretty sure.
Maybe.
I think we got you. Okay. Well, we'll continue this later, but it basically, there's this, I did this my freshman year in college, so it's been a long time since I read it, but the basic thing I understood was, he's a Scandinavian. There's this guy, and they're just kind of just making it, and they're marginalized, whatever, and I think the one guy has no job, but they've got this wild duck that they're taking care of, and it's such a big deal, to whatever, and so that gives him meaning. And this old doctor in town kind of encourages this kind of stuff, and he's like, oh, that's what you're doing is so important, and things like that. Well, the young doctor knows this is BS. He's just, kind of placating the guy, and he comes in, and he, it's like, no, you got to tear down the life lies. We want to be authentic, and let's just face what is it. And none of this stuff is meaningful. This is Obama talking on the West Coast. He was first running for president to say, well, these people need meaning in their lives, so they've got guns and religion, and that is true. But he got in a whole bunch of trouble saying that. But the basic idea was that everyone.
I remember that.
That was huge.
I remember why
at the time. It's like Romney talking about the 47% of the takers. We're the makers, and the 47% are takers. They're never going to vote for Republicans.
Right. Oh, that's right. It was
Once
like secretly recorded or something like that. Yeah,
and Obama was the same way. In both cases, they were talking to fundraisers. Funders. Right. Because they, these, what I'm talking about, right?
Right.
And so. That's what it's about. Well,
what's wrong with finding meaning in religion and guns, though? I think.
Well,
I guess when it's
that's
being
exactly what culturally responsive stuff would do.
Yeah, I guess if you're part of that group, and Obama, who's not part of your guns and religion, is talking about you without you in the room, I guess that could be
even if you're in the room, to say that somehow my values of what's meaningful are obviously better than your values of what's meaningful.
Right.
But we all do that. And that's this culturally responsive stuff. So that's what I'm trying to work on. So anyway, that's where we should stop probably. But the end of the Wild Duck is that the guy realizes it's all bull, and he goes off and I think shoots the duck, and and so what's the answer? You got to help people create meaning.
Well, thanks for doing this, Dad.
Indeed.
Until next time.
Until next and next. Well, let's hope there's many next in the future.